Start things off. Okay, so this is our action workshop, and we were going to discuss, I was going to discuss legislative action, and then Meghan was going to discuss a little bit about, what the Extinction Rebellion is doing, and then what the Climate Reality Project is. But very briefly, so we're going to do that for about 15 minutes each, or 12 minutes each, if we're trying to cut time. And then we're going to break into smaller groups and see what people, talk to one another and maybe brainstorm some action ideas you have. But before we get started in like the first 2 minutes, what are you all hoping to get out of this workshop? Why are you here? So to be sure that we can respond to you.
Well, I'd like to have some idea of the latest in terms of New York State legislation, and also some advice on how to approach legislators. Some information on the groups that are going to, like, lobby and so on. And then I guess one other thing I was hoping maybe that people would have ideas about, which I think you're going to be talking about anyway in your talk, which is how can we all on board with regard to discussing climate change and how we put personal action.
Okay. What other ideas?
Well, now that we have New York Renews, how do we make that happen? Because they passed it, but now how do we make it implemented?
Okay. Anything else?
I want to move beyond the description of how shitty the situation is and how we need to be hopeful to what can we actually do to make some change.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm also a member of a group called the People's Music Network, and we are progressive musicians. I'm actually up here from New York City, so I'm not that local. But one of the things I'd like to do is make contacts and give out my card, not just for me, but to be a contact. One of the things I find very disturbing is the lack of music in popular movements these days, or just the reliance on stars. And music is a powerful motivator, a powerful unifier, a powerful way to help build a movement.
Okay.
So, well, what I also want to be able to offer is not for me necessarily, but if you want, we have people who are local to a lot of different areas. So if you want a musician to help with your activity, I want you to know you can get in touch with me.
Okay. So I'm going to try to go for about 13 minutes. You want to keep talking, Megan? Sure. So it's 1 o'clock, and then Megan will go for about 13 minutes, and then we're going to talk about breaking into smaller groups. So I'm primarily going to talk about legislation. There's more people here than I anticipated. But I'm going to pass around two things. First, we're going to go to the right, is we did just pass a climate bill, and that gives a quick, only 10 of them, and it gives a quick summary of the climate bill that was passed this year. And then this one is just what I've written down as my own organization. What are some of the priorities that we're going to be moving forward in the future. So real briefly, we passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And some people can rightfully argue that that is the strongest piece of climate legislation that has been passed by any state to date. And other of us would argue that the legislation is grossly inadequate to the situation at hand, and it was actually a pretty major failure on the part of the New York State legislature in terms of what they did. So there's some real difference of opinion on that. Putting that aside, however, now that they have passed this bill, which sets some standards for what we should do on climate, I would say probably the biggest one they have said is that by 2030 we want to get 70% of the state electricity coming from renewable energy. That's the big one. They have set up a climate council that's going to, over the next 3 years, develop a more comprehensive plan as to how the state can meet goals in terms of not only reducing emissions from electricity, which is the easiest, because only about 20% of the carbon footprint is from electricity, but also how do you begin to make progress on buildings, heating and cooling buildings, and transportation, both of which account for about over 30%, a third of the state's carbon footprint. And the legislation that was passed recently really didn't say anything directly about buildings or transportation. Sort of the big issue that people felt was really missing among many was that it did not address the issue of halting fossil fuel infrastructure. And that issue is likely to come back and be fought in the legislature next year. What we've seen in other countries like Germany, even as you increase the amount of renewable energy you're getting from wind and solar, it doesn't mean you actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so you got to be able to do both. You got to build things out, but you got to stop the fossil fuel projects. And I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but the vast majority of energy in New York State right now comes from natural gas, fracked gas. And increasingly people realize that natural gas, which has methane and methane leakage, may be actually worse than, say, burning coal. Because methane, short term, is up to 80 times more potent as greenhouse gas than carbon. So that was the general bill that was passed. One of the things people are going to be looking at is what does the New York State do short term to increase renewable energy. So in 2002, Governor Pataki first set out climate goals for New York State to increase renewable energy. So that's been 17 years ago. And so over 17 years, we have managed, maybe, to get 5% of the state's electricity coming from wind and solar. Some people say even that 5% is a little bit on the high side. In 17 years, we've gotten 5%. Okay, to get from, and we start off with a base of around 20% from hydro. So we have about 25%, 26% if you include not biogas, biomass, which many of us are not supportive of. So about 26%. So to get from 26% renewable energy right now to 70% by 2030, basically in 10 years, the quick math is about, you're going to be adding 4.5% a year for wind and solar. Took us 17 years to do the first 5%. Now we're going to do 4% every single year. So some of us, including unfortunately the governor, is pretty skeptical as to whether or not we're going to be able to even accomplish that limited goal. We think the goal is too little. We don't think they can accomplish the goal that they put into place. It is unclear how much money they actually give to renewable energy at this point. None of this money goes through the budget process. It's all what's called off budget. Basically, it's been ordered by the Public Service Commission, and we pay for it on our utility bills. So when they pass the state budget, they don't appropriate money for renewable energy. It's just all done by the governor. And actually, for the last 30 years, the New York State Legislature has had literally no role whatsoever on climate or renewable energy. And that's why so many were disappointed in this recent bill, because for the first time in 30 years, the New York State Legislature had the chance, because now the Democrats control the Senate, to actually say something. And what they did was they took an executive order that was written, actually by my wife, 10 years ago, when she was the governor's secretary for the environment. And they took this executive order and they put that into law. It is better to have things by law than by executive order, but the idea that you're taking the same climate policies from 10 years ago, that's a little bit frightening. The governor in January did increase some of his goals. And so basically, what the governor said in January were all the climate goals that were ended up in the bill. Everything came from him, nothing from the legislature. What the groups were trying to do was to do some really good things. And that is that we need to ensure that whatever we do on climate change directly addresses people of color and low-income people. And so they fought very hard to get 40% of whatever funding we give towards climate change to go to disadvantaged communities. And then they also try to put in labor standards to require basically living wage jobs, union jobs, and build out renewable energy. Cuomo killed all of it in the last week of the negotiations. Entire labor standards were removed. They did keep in, and this is the big change, they did keep in the concept that we have to target climate funds to disadvantaged communities. That's good. But they went from a mandate to a vague goal. They changed what funds were applied to. Now we basically ignoring all the funding already committed, so only talking about any future funding. And then the governor changed the definition of disadvantaged communities to include low and moderate income people. Well, low and moderate income people are pretty good, you know. But what percentage of the population is that? 60%, 65% of the population is low and moderate income people. So what we agreed to is have a goal that 35% of any climate funds will now go to 65% of the population. Not exactly groundbreaking. Excuse me?
Typical Cuomo.
Typical Cuomo and the legislature, you know, sort of caved. So people are going to fight next session to see what can we do to actually implement some type of expansion of renewable energy. People are going to fight, I think, pretty hard to say we need to get some amount of funds, begin to get dedicated towards low and moderate income, disadvantaged communities, particularly things like energy retrofit, to fight to stop fossil fuels. And then the industry types, and they're right, are going to fight to change the siting laws in New York State for renewable energy. Right now, it is virtually impossible to site a large-scale solar or wind system. One of the reasons only get 5% coming from solar and wind. I think the fastest they've done so far has been 10 years. So if it takes you 10 years to site any wind system, and you have 11 years left before the IPC says we're up, you know, the creek without a paddle, that's not good. And so, what?
What do you mean by site?
Build. You say, I want to go build right here. I want to go put 500 solar units on this site. I got to go to the town to get a permit, probably go to Article 10 and get a permit, and the town will say, you know, this is a terrible location. It's got to be, you know, someplace else. We got to do an environmental impact. And we got to figure out where are the birds coming here, you know, in this, and where are the wolves, and, you know, and you go through this sort of 10-year process. Now in Texas leads the country, believe it or not, in wind, and they got 17% of their power coming from wind. It takes them 3 months in Texas to site a wind project. I was surprised. I said they had to actually go through a permit process in Texas. I said they could just build whatever they want anywhere they want. But 3 months may be a little bit quick, 10 years is too long, so people will have to somewhere squeeze between the 3 years and the, you know, closer to a 2-year process. Other groups will certainly work to try to implement the CLCPA. So, you know, there's a 3-year planning process. One of the things they did, literally at the last moment, they took the plan from 2 years and they added on the 3rd year. So after the next governor is elected. So this governor's not going to have any responsibility for the plan that's being developed.
I thought fracking was now off the table.
Well, fracking in New York State is off the table, yes.
Okay, I thought you had mentioned that it wasn't, okay.
Well, but no, natural gas is flooding the state. And natural gas has been presumed to be cheaper. So we just import enormous amounts of fracked gas from Pennsylvania. We don't want the environmental damage caused by fracking in New York State. We don't care if Pennsylvania destroys their state, but we're going to protect New York. So we're importing a tremendous amount, and that's what all these gas pipes are about.
Who doesn't care?
Who doesn't care? Cuomo.
The 10 years that you're talking about to supposedly build a windmill system, is that?
Please?
Yeah. So I'm curious to know if the 10 years to do the environmental impact study and all that you said to build a renewable source, is that because you have pro-fossil fuel interests who are delaying the process deliberately? You know, because like...
It tends to be more local residents, and we can talk about how to sort of solve that.
Okay, good.
One of the reasons, say, like the Greens support public ownership, which is what they use more in, say, like Germany and Europe, is that it's better if the public comes in and decides where they want to build these systems, as opposed to the private developer running around town and saying, well, here's a nice, cheap piece of property, I'm going to buy it up, not tell anybody, then I get down to the town hall, and then 40 people come out and tell you, well, that's a lousy site. It'd be much better if there's an open process. Listen, we're going to build 2 or 3 of these systems in our town, where do we put them? Put them on the landfill, put them on parking lots, put them on brownfield. That's a whole complicated issue. We're probably about out of time. So one last question.
Good. Yeah, I was wondering about the feasibility of the whole coast, because Massachusetts, first of all, Rhode Island, that one little
Right.
step, but then Massachusetts has approved
Right.
a significant
Yes.
wind farm off the coast, and I figured that would start, and move down the eastern seaboard.
Yes. New York has moved on that. It's something that the whole country's been slow upon.
Yeah.
One of the things Cuomo did in January is he made a commitment to 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. I will say, our groups have been calling for 10,000 megawatts by 2030. And we were attacked by certain big-name environmental groups for being outrageously high with our demands, completely unreasonable. And when Cuomo came in at 9,000 in 2035, for some reason they didn't attack him. So we are moving, but there are a lot of issues on how you actually do it. And the last bid in Massachusetts came in at 6.5 cents per kilowatt hour for offshore wind, which is really good.
That's amazing.
It's, because 5.5 cents is the wholesale cost. The one that we're building, we have approved one on Long Island.
Yeah.
That's at 17 cents, and the Block Island one was 24 cents. 6.5 cents, which we think was not realistic. That would be really good if we could work with that. May.
Well,
So we're going to come back in 13 minutes, and we're going to talk about what we're going to do for the rest of the time. Meg's going to present that.
Sure. I might actually stand up because I have a little scoliosis and my back is funky, and I want to make sure that I speak to everybody. Or I can. And I wasn't sure. I'm kind of glad that there's no PowerPoint, but I have a couple of notes on Extinction Rebellion on my computer, so I'll leave it here. My name is Meghan Marohn, and I appreciate you all being here. And I feel like I'm definitely growing as a result of this conference, particularly in the way that Dar talks and has spoken about, and in some of his writing about kind of emotional transparency. He has a lot of writing too about coming back from reporting in Iraq and dealing with rage and grief and emotions that are typically just considered like, push it down, do not let that be seen visibly socially. And that connects quite a bit to, I think, all of our lives, but also to Extinction Rebellion, which is a movement that Mark and I are both a part of, and Marohn and Alex and other people here are a part of, and grief and emotional reckoning, I would say, is part of the foundational organizational, I guess, structure, you could say, or imperative. So in terms of like my own political activism, I remember the moment I went to an all-women's high school and an all-women's college, and I remember the moment. Oh yeah, we've got people way back there. We've got people. I remember the moment that I walked into the computer lab and I was writing papers at Russell Sage, and I remember going on to like CNN.com or something to get the news, and the Monica Lewinsky scandal had broken. And then it said there's some article about how Bill Clinton decided to bomb clean water pipelines in Iraq. And these two events coinciding. So I just kind of like to tell that story to myself because obviously that's under a Democrat. And the corruption of our system is so thorough at this point in time. But that was my own political awakening under Bill Clinton, that so many of the systems that we inhabit are just utterly bogus. And I don't know what he was distracting from. It might have been a perfect like reciprocal distraction where the bombing of Iraq was distracting from potential impeachment stuff, and potential impeachment stuff was well, I'm sure he didn't love that, but that was distracting from the fact that he was bombing and the government was bombing Iraq and clean water pipelines that would have brought clean water to women and children. So then I feel like I'm reckoning right now in my life with how much I have emotionally bifurcated and numbed myself and distracted myself and also gotten cynical, which is not pretty to admit. But I think that in my adult life, in order to survive and have a job within the system, there's been a lot of cynicism that, I have to play games in order to make money, have a career, survive on my own. And an example of that would be that I'm a high school English teacher, and one of my really good friends is down in New Jersey where I taught for years. We became friends English teaching outside of New York. And the National Council of Teachers of English came out in the spring with an edict or a declaration that English teachers should be teaching about climate change. So I always feel like I'm perpetually Bambi, where I take these things really literally, and then I go into school and I started teaching. I started to think of all the ways that this moment is great for teaching rhetoric and writing and thinking. All of the youth that we have that are speaking out, like Emma Gonzalez speaking out about gun violence, and Greta Thunberg and how she's using rhetoric to make these points about the climate. And then it's just so hard to try to change these systems because then I work in a district that has some very wealthy people, some very poor people. It's a real contrast. And I was told, parents complained that I was teaching about climate change. And I was told that I should only teach, we had to promise a certain group of parents that I would only teach Shakespeare for the remaining month of school and prepare the students for the final exam. So kind of like how also Dar was saying, you want to give like hope and be real, but I don't often tell those stories because I start feeling like the Saturday Night Live character Debbie Downer all the time, And but I think we have to be telling these stories and connecting with each other about what's really going on and how difficult it is to actually confront the complexity of these issues. An interesting statistic came out, though, that a lot of parents actually really do want their children's teachers talking about climate change. So it's just such a politically volatile time that you just have like this one group that is just extremely in denial, and it's very difficult to permeate that ideology. I've spent the summer.
In the spring, you stopped talking about climate change.
What's that?
Because of the parents who said stop talking about climate change, what did you do?
Well, to keep my job, I had to, but I've spent the summer thinking about whether I'm going to go back to my job, and also like going to be talking to different administrative officials about like what are we really doing here. I need to know about support, in terms of that type of censorship. Also, the student had videotaped me talking about climate change, so it was like a whole thing. So anyway, My other experience, though, is with Occupy. I was a part of the Occupy movement in New York, and now I'm doing some organizational stuff in the Capital Region with Extinction Rebellion. So I feel like I've never had tons of faith in the system. I've kind of had like a bifurcated life of doing my professional teaching life and kind of like infusing poetry and essays that would get students to see the world in a different way and hopefully live a different kind of life. And then also do movements. But I've never really had a ton of faith in necessarily legislative stuff. So, yes, Extinction Rebellion is was formed in November of 2018 by Greta Thunberg and Roger Hallam, who's one of the UK leaders, had spent 6 years researching how movements work. And then basically in the fall of 2018, especially after the IPCC report came out, people in England started, mobilizing, protesting. So I'm going to tell you the main demands of Extinction Rebellion, and then this book, This is an Uprising, is kind of the manual that people, especially in England, started using for activism and organizing. And at the end of the book, the Engler siblings who wrote this talk about the way that movements have eaten themselves by people fighting, like, the people who are going for legislative and policy change, fighting with the people who are doing prefigurative communities, like Country Joe and the Fish did back in the 60s, like wanting to just be off the grid and live a different kind of life, versus the people who are doing nonviolent direct action, like laying down in pipelines, and it's all needed. Obviously, the crisis is at the point that everything is needed. So our breakout session is going to be to ask you, I assume we're talking with people who have a lot of experience here, so to ask you to share with either one other person or a couple of other people which pathway you've already been going down in your life, or which pathways you've engaged. Have you done any nonviolent direct action or any letter writing, policy type changes? Have you been a part of any eco communities, things like that? And then asking you to share that, and also just to think about where you would like to go in terms of whatever your action is going to be. So I'll just lastly share with you
Who is it who wrote that book?
this is by Mark and Paul Engler, and it has a foreword by Bill McKibben, who said that the movements, like SNCC and all of the movements for social change have not really had a compiled manual yet that kind of worked for people, and that a lot of people have found that this is a pretty comprehensive manual for looking at what has worked and what hasn't in terms of movements. So I'll just share with you the basic precepts of Extinction Rebellion in case that's a new pathway that you would like to explore, because there's an Extinction Rebellion in the Capital Region and you could start coming to the meetings. So I would say that, of course, the big criticism of Occupy was that, people would say Occupy failed, and I would kind of internally roll my eyes, because it's like, I don't think that people ever thought that there was going to be a permanent encampment within this park by a monument in New York City, and I kind of always pictured it almost like a dollhouse, like people playing pretend or theater, where, for better or for worse, it's all temporal, it's all transient, but people are playing at the world that they want to see. So it's a little prefigurative. There were nonviolent direct actions that were planned at Occupy, such as marches and blockades, or Cornel West and Chris Hedges getting arrested in front of chaining themselves to Goldman Sachs. And in terms of policy, you're trying to just get people to change their thinking. So just the fact that people said we are the 99% versus the 1%, and looking at this massive wealth inequality would be considered the success of Occupy. Not that Occupy was supposed to have any sort of permanent, position. Although sometimes having homes and land certainly helps with these movements. So I'm going to share with you the main precepts of Extinction Rebellion. Again, I have a sign-up form, so in case you want to join Extinction Rebellion. So the one thing that's interesting is that they kind of turn our founding fathers' documents on their heads. So John Locke has a quote that John Locke is a father of liberalism, said, when a government fails to protect the lives and livelihoods of its citizens, the people have a right to rebel. So there's so much of a focus on individual rights and private property, which is our founding documents and our own ideology. But XR takes that statement by Locke and says that statement is our right to then rebel because things are being stolen from us. You know, there's this massive thievery going on of our land, our rights, our privacy, all of those things. Okay, so I'll just run through the precepts. Number one, the government must tell the truth about the ecological emergency and reverse inconsistent policies and work alongside the media to communicate to the citizens. Number two, the government must enact legally binding policies to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025. And it must cooperate internationally so that the global economy runs on no more than half of the planet's worth of resources.
Can you speak much louder, please?
Sure.
Keep your voice.
I'll just show you. I'll just test it out. Okay, so the third one is we do not trust our government to make bold, swift, and long-term changes. So this is a point from Greta Thunberg as well that people have already let us down. Like, so we're sick of saying that Cuomo is letting us down. Like, Extinction Rebellion is a little bit like further move away from policy change because the idea is like wake up, smell the coffee. The elected officials are not coming to save us. We demand a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, indigenous people, people of color, and poor communities. That's a huge one. There's a focus on, those are the main ones that I'll focus on for now, but I'll just speak before we break up into groups that also foundational to XR is the whole reckoning with grief, that the whole idea is that kind of like the definition of hoping that you're doing something even if you don't know the outcome. XR wants to build communities that will hold each other in emotional authenticity as we do whatever we can to still mediate this crisis in some way. Almost less that there's going to be a positive outcome and more that it's just the type of human that you want to be in the years that you have remaining on planet Earth. That you want to be one of the humans that like bound together with other people and face this truth. So
Do we want to take one or two questions, clarifying questions?
Sure. Can we do it after groups? Is that okay? Can people hold on to their questions for time, or want to do it now?
Clarifying questions.
Yeah.
And we may take two or three at once.
I just was wondering, demanding.
Louder.
Several of the points are demanding this and this. Who are you demanding these things from? If you're not talking to the government, you're talking to God, who are you talking to?
Pat?
Yeah.
We take all three questions.
Oh, okay.
I'll stand up to project. She is a teacher. You can tell how wonderful she must be. And I find it tragic to lose teachers like this. So I'm going to ask, is it possible to teach Shakespeare with kind of modern interpretations, modern issues? I mean, it's been done in Shakespeare has been modernized and dramatized. Wouldn't that be possible? And I also thought of Melissa's anthology on of Justice, which is an anthology of excellent poetry. Can't some of that be used in classrooms where kids still have to pass tests and get into university?
Third question. You have another question? Last question.
In response to Patricia's idea of can you use Shakespeare, if you go to one of the Henry where he and Hotspur, and there's a perfect definition. Hotspur's wife says to him, "This is how you are when you sleep," and it's a classic definition of PTSD. So how does war affect people whose business it is in war? So we have people coming back.
Okay,
wounded.
since you're short on here, so you have two questions. One is, who you demanding to, or who are we demanding to? And then second, can we get Shakespeare to talk about that?
Yeah.
Minute and a half.
Yeah, I just love the fact that you heard that story, and both of your brains went to the point of like, well, Shakespeare is dealing with these massive issues, you know? Because I think that I was so upset when everything happened that I didn't even think about that. I was like, oh, I'm being told what to teach, and my professional organization told me that it's fine. But anyway, yeah, it's whether we can be creative in the systems. But I think in order to survive emotionally, I also need a community. And Extinction Rebellion, as it's forming in the capital region, has provided me with a lot of community to talk with people about what's really going on. And then and XR is talking to the government and to the general masses to try to say, like, if you feel weird, I mean, teenagers have massive anxiety and depression issues right now. I think that's just their intuition being squelched. Like, it's just their intuition that things are very strange right now. So I think that the message of XR is to government and also just to people in general.
So these small groups, we have 35 people.
Oh, okay. So it's however you feel comfortable breaking up. But basically, the first question that I would like you to be able to introduce each other. So just how you identify. I feel like we have a lot of great people here at the conference who have kind of been emotionally vulnerable and identifying themselves and giving us kind of creative ways to think about identity and spirituality. But maybe just introducing yourself to the person next to you about who are you. Then in terms of what you've already done, because I was assuming that we would have a lot of people who have done a lot of work within the group. So out of the different change pathways, at the end of this book they call it the Ecology of Change. Which of the change pathways have you used? Have you written letters to people? Have you, appealed, spoken in front of a legislature? And has that been part of your experience? Have you done any nonviolent direct action movements? Have you been a part of any communities that are trying to form like, alternative systems? And then lastly, just to bring back to all of us, and partially this is because I'm curious, is these issues are so complex and there's so much that I just thought we could end with a brainstorm on how we communicate, particularly with children, because it is tough in terms of what you let in, what you talk about with children in terms of the space of history that we're at. So any ideas that you have on this last question? So I'm going to let people break into two what's that?
How many groups?
It doesn't matter how many groups, it's more just people either being with one other person or a few other people if that's more comfortable to you. Whatever is more comfortable.
And are you expecting people to report back?
And we will report back.
So we have how many minutes in these small groups?
I think we can go, we started late and we got permission to go a little late, so I would like us to have 10 minutes to meet and 10 minutes to report back, if that's possible. Yeah?
I was just talking with Maureen, and she said the next presenter is at 1:45, which is in 10 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay.
I don't know. I'm just reflecting.
I'm sorry to take space, but I feel like I need to. I've been working on these things for 10 years. I lived at the No Dapple campus for 6 months. I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I really do have to respond to your work because I do feel, I know, like, professors who work on recycling windmills, and windmills are just not a solution. This is a thing that I need to push push because the cable that would go through New York Harbor would destroy the ecology there. And what we need to be looking at is small-scale solutions. We need a power plant in every home. It's called a off-grid and small-scale, and this is so possible. We now have the technology where we can use plants as solar panels. We can take plastic and strip the hydrogen off of it and put it into a wood stove that produces all of your heat and steam and doesn't need any wires or any roads. This is what we need to see. We need to be able to see with a pattern lens at the world and see that this Roman Catholic Leviathan has grown up out of Europe and devoured the earth. And now it's been 500 years of struggle and cooptation between the Leviathan and the Turtle Island cultures. And democracy is a Haudenosaunee concept, and it has been corrupted and used against the people of this earth. But we have all of the philosophical ground to stand on. Fascism was ostensibly defeated in the 40s, but it was only done so in a cooptative way. And in the 60s and 69, we saw that fascism lived. And with Nixon, I know, with my generation, I can't say these things. People don't know history well enough. But that is your strength and your power. You've seen a lot of this story. And I urge you all to go out and talk to a punk on the street and tell him that you'll support him to take over a building on Clinton Avenue in Melbourne. We need squats. We need free space for a prefigurative culture to grow. That is why XR is not grown here in the States as it has in the UK. Because there is nowhere for young activists to live without paying rent. Rent sucks all of us dry, and it sucks. So I'm 30 now, I'm 29, and Occupy was like the revolution was coming, and then we all got betrayed. Like we got evicted and no one cared. And I went back to engineering school and then I hitchhiked across the country.
And we're going to do small groups.
And so what I'm saying is that you need to get back to actual action. You need to stop paying taxes. You need to take squats. You need to take land away from the empire and support the youth to lead.
Well, what should we do? We have a conundrum because I overplanned. This is the teacher problem. They always say it's better to overplan than underplan, but sometimes, is there a particular issue you'd like to address?
I'm wondering whether you can guide the conversation so even as a large group, we get something out of it. And I would trust your sense that that's the best way to use the time.
Sure.
What's the controversy on offshore windmills? I hadn't heard this before. This gentleman announced that there's some.
They're usually owned by oil companies. They're usually owned by oil companies. They require dredging a cable through the seafloor, which in New York Harbor will involve a massive ecological crisis because of all the pollution that's in there.
So people disagree. So there's disagreements on a lot of.
But I'm a mechanical engineer and I study these things better than anyone else. I know more about these things than literally anyone you've ever talked to because I've studied them. I was told about overpopulation when I was 12, and I've been devoted to solving these problems for 20 years.
I would suggest that anyone who wants to talk with you further does so after the workshop, and that we finish. We have just 5 minutes, so just an alternative, because it's a challenge to swing, would be that we do break and we meet someone else, and we do discuss what you suggested, which is what we have done, what they have done.
Sure, yeah,
And
get
it's
to
a
know
very
each other.
communal way to finish.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Just get to know another person and understand what their experience is. We probably don't have time to report back too much.
But just that's a nice way to end.
Yeah, and then when we'll just come back just to do a blessing right at the end, just to quickly reconvene.
So we have 5 minutes.
Yes, just to talk to one other person, maybe a couple other people about
I know
who you
you
are,
know
what your
it's good to see
experience
you
has been. Yes, if you could stand when you're sharing, just so that we can hear.
Well, this is amazing because both of us are involved in the same kind of thing. Glens Falls and Guilderland
just promised to become climate smart communities. It's a program by the state. It brings money to your town. It's something you can participate in as a citizen. So look up Climate Smart Community. It's a state program, and you can talk to your town officials to see if they're interested in pursuing that direction. You get points for different projects, and all the projects have something to do with sustainability. So it's really worth looking into. It's a way to participate with your town, and it's heading in the right direction.
And the other program is Community Choice Aggregation Programs, which your town can sign up for, which basically changes the default choice for electricity to a renewable source. So right now it's probably a fossil fuel source. If your town will sign up for these community choice aggregation programs, we can switch entire populations to renewables in bulk.
Thank you. Yeah, keeping it local. Yeah. Let's have a couple other people share before we disperse. So anything else that you learned from other people? Or go ahead, if you have something that you want to share.
I didn't get to share with my group, so I have just a few things, resources that are available. There are some resources that are available online. One is called climateinteractive.org, and it was put together by professors at MIT, systems analysts, but they have a lot of slides available, a lot of background information available. They also have a UN climate simulation to engage people in the and hopefully get them personally interested in the climate issues, so that they can they do this by negotiating with one another to keep the Earth's temperature below 2 degrees Celsius by a certain year, and they have a very good computer simulation that they use, that was actually used in regular negotiations, that they make available to you to play with, in a sense, and for the groups to use for this negotiations. And then climate reality training, I noticed that you had it on your thing. I just got back from Minneapolis, climate reality training, which is Al Gore's climate reality training. He's just now trained 20,000 climate activists. Basically, you don't go away with them telling you do this or do that. They simply inform you and energize you and give you hope, really, and bring people together to talk about this. They have great post-training support, and I would suggest that, it's free training, you just have to get there and pay for your housing. So, I would suggest that people, yes, it's called Climate Reality Project, and it's a training. Okay, so that's basically it.
Where does the training take place?
Well, it's all over the world. So it just happened in Minneapolis. Before that, it was in Australia. Before that, it was in Atlanta. It has been in Philadelphia. So they think from just what I see, it looks like they kind of alternate between in the United States, out of the United States, in the United States, out of the United States. And I think that they try to do maybe 3 to 4 a year. So it's very worthwhile. Yes. Okay.
My only thing with Climate Reality Project, because I did do it, is that you just have to remember that with what Dar was saying in his speeches, that even the IPCC report is extremely off. We're probably not getting out of a 3 degrees Celsius temperature warm. And so that's why these communities, figuring out how we're going to relate to each other just as humans is going to be really important, because even the Climate Reality Project Al Gore is basing it on we're going to translate the economy, and that's kind of tricky.
All right. Well, excuse me. I just want to say something, and I didn't hear him say anything about it this time around. He was basically talking about climate change is actually happening, and that we need to get out there and talk about it and do something about it.
Oh, sure.
I think it's clear. First of all, even if you go around here, you will hear 20 different ideas, almost as many as there are people for what they want to do. Yes, this is a crisis. A crisis is also an opportunity for great change. And we need to look at it that way. And there are many different ways to attack the problem. Nothing is going to be changed by just one idea. I personally, and I do think that the most important thing is direct action where possible, including electoral action. For example, even just making sure that at the next election, we have someone going hard at Cuomo, because he's a consummate politician, he's an opportunist. That opportunism can also be pushed to the left if he feels like he's going to lose his job. Now, I don't want him in that job, but I'm just saying there's a lot of things that we can do, and I don't think we should be discouraged. Find other people who are working on what you want to work on, do it. The only thing I would say, don't totally pull out of society, you know. For me, that's what destroyed the left movement in Israel. People went to kibbutzes, and they pulled out of day-to-day activity there, and right now the extreme right wing controls the country. And pulling out is a way of just giving up. And I'll be damned if I'm going to give up. Sorry. We're probably going to be permanently changed by this, but we can deal with it in many ways.
Agreed.
Okay?
A couple of people have asked about how can I get involved, or how do I get myself informed as a climate reality project. I think Lois actually was going to try to compile a list of different groups in the Capital District, but you're talking about people involved in United for Safe Energy, which I'm involved with, 350.org, nationally, Sierra Club, Food and Water Watch,
We gotta move past these
Extinction
though. There's
Rebellion.
also Symbiosis Revolution. They're making a continental confederation of cooperatives, and we really need to.
Can you please
No,
wait until I
because
finish?
you're talking about all things that are
You
cooperative
can say what
solutions.
you want to say.
I know,
after I
but
finish
people have
speaking.
heard this. They know about 350. They don't know about
This
Symbiosis
woman here
Revolution.
did not know
And
about
we need
it.
a revolution. We do not.
I agree, but you should also work on what you're working on and prove that it works. We need a revolution, but the revolution does not preclude
Yes, it
other
does. These are
people.
not solutions. They've existed,
okay.
they're not helping. I'm sorry. You need to put your energy towards things that are new. We need to confederate into a new government and channel all of the resources that the people here have to people who can actually think outside of electoral
I'm really
politics,
uncomfortable with
and
him
empower
calling
themselves.
Remind me of Donald
There is
Trump,
one.
everybody else
There is
down.
one true strategy, and that is to empower ourselves. We don't know how to farm. We don't know how to catch energy from the sun anymore. We're all addicted to oil, and that is the only strategy that matters. Get free of oil.
It's like the Vietnam War
Thank you.
days.
So what I was trying to say is there are plenty of groups out there who are working at the local level. Many towns also have their own climate groups. And once you start reading the stuff, you'll find out more about it. Dar's book in the back is probably a very good introduction to some of the climate, science type issues. And there are things like climate news that you can subscribe to on a daily basis. We'll send you out various news articles from around the country about what's going on with climate. And a lot of websites, Facebook pages. GELF, which is my group, GE, New York Green Elf is our Facebook page. We try to put about 6 or 7 articles a day on our Facebook page. Just reports about what's going on with climate. Other reports?
I just want to say there's such a thing as carbon farming. My stick on like pulling carbon out of the air through photosynthesis. Microbes that keep it in the ground for centuries. They can reverse global warming. There's legislation in the Assembly. It's going to be reintroduced in 2020. And I've got literature on it on the back table next to Dar's book. Talk to me if you want to know.
Say your name?
Cherie.
Cherie.
Yeah. From Albany area.
Thank you.
Okay, pretty intense. I feel like I need my Buddhist Sangha right now.
Well, he's right about one thing. We need a revolution. He just doesn't know how to get there.
Well, and everybody wants to feel safe and comfortable and feel like we have a future, and it brings up tons of emotions, very emotional stuff, which is why I was hoping to talk with some of you about your ideas of speaking with children. So if you still want to talk with me about how you approach this, your ideas of how you talk with young people, I would love to converse with you about how to do that. because it is very emotional, tricky stuff. And hopefully we all feel like we can have our own pathway, whatever that is, towards doing, we need everybody, and we need everybody doing anything going generally in the right direction. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here.
What school district? What school district you work for?
May I ask everyone, if you could fold your chair and just put it outside, leaning against the building, we'll get, or if
No,
you...
bring it back.
All right, yes, bring it back right now.
Yeah, bring it back.
I just don't want to lose it.